So we want to talk about the greatest generation, which is made up of people who were born between. Actually, I didn't. It says in certain resources that you can find a certain age range, but it's really anybody before 1927, and you know people who were born almost 100 years ago. So you can imagine they're in their 90s at this point, and they probably remembered as young kids the Great Depression of the 1930s, and so that was no small thing to go through. And then in the 40s, of course, with World War II. So they went through a lot just in the first 20 years of their life, and so they're called the greatest generation because I guess Tom Brokaw, who was the NBC newscaster, he called them the greatest because they were the ones who fought in World War II and won. So
They
I guess
saved the world.
yeah, they basically saved the world. Yeah, and so they get to be called the greatest because of that. So. So we can go on. I have a lot of info about like some of their culture and some of the things that they went through and their values. But what do you think is relevant for our discussion?
Uh, well, I could just say for my own community, we don't have anyone in this age range. You have to be 95 or older to
Mm,
qualify, I think. So, um, I tip my hat to these folks. They seem like great people, but let's
right.
see if we can move on a little bit
Yeah.
here and
Yeah. Then
um,
that's the thing.
jump
There
into
are
the next one.
Yeah, so the silent generation is the next generation, and that's going to be people who were born between 1928 and 1945, and that means that they did, in a sense, live through. At least the older ones lived through World War II, but were not old enough to fight in it. But they then, and this is the important part, they then got to experience the new age that came after World War II, the atomic age, as people would refer to it, the reality of living in a world where superpowers had nuclear weapons that could destroy the whole world. And we're still living that today, but they got to experience the shift from living a relatively normal, quiet life, and then having to experience World War II, and then living in this new normal. And with the idea of the Cold War with the USSR, like that was the constant fear of war, World War III, I guess, but also the fear that communism would infiltrate the United States. And even though I'm Canadian, most of this is from an American perspective because I'm much more interested in American history than Canadian.
Okay. Well, I agree. I'm also more interested in
Yeah,
American history. So these folks would be 77 years old as of the time of this recording and older,
right.
up to 95, 94. And yeah, there's probably a lot of these people still around in the world today, and they are the silent generation. Why are they called the silent generation?
It's because they are the generation that really put their head down, got to work. Because one of the main things that defines this generation is after the men came home from World War II and sort of resumed their lives, they wanted to have a normal life. They had just gone through the worst thing that they could imagine, that anybody could imagine, and then came home and they wanted normalcy, right? So they got married, they had children, and they had jobs and tried to give their kids, as people will call it, the American dream, right? Give them every opportunity. And this is the main thing. And like one of the resources that I read to get ready for this sermon series and for this podcast is a book by Hayden Shaw. It's about it's called Sticking Points, and it's about the current five generations that are working together and how you can understand them and how they can get along. And so he's talking from a work related perspective, whereas I was looking for how the generations interact in a church setting. But the many of the
Not
things
all that
remain
different,
true.
though, right?
Yeah, because you are working together in ministry. And so again, the people in this silent generation, they had the mindset of let's just I guess think of this. Think of Ward and June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver. That's the silent generation. They were raising the next generation in the 50s and so on and into the 60s. And they caused the baby boom. So maybe we should talk
Right.
about the baby boom.
Okay, so the silent generation then are the stereotypical parents of boomers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that helps me
Yeah.
because I have some exposure to that whole world, and so these are like my grandparents'
Yeah.
generation, and other Gen X's and millennials maybe have grandparents in this category as well.
Right.
And they, what are their values?
So as I sort of alluded to, strong work ethic,
Okay.
taking responsibility. Perhaps the other way of the other area that they strongly value is traditional roles, morals. Doing the right thing because that's what their parents did and that's what they did, going to war for their country, and then coming home and the man took over the role of breadwinner, and the mom stayed home and the kids respected their parents. That's what they expected, at least. Didn't quite work out that way with their kids, but we'll get there. But that's what they expected.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
In a kind of tragic way. What they really wanted was normalcy because they had heard stories of, at least, or
Right.
maybe even had lived through uh, just the whole world falling apart and the whole world getting to a place where like really huge numbers of people were dying,
Yeah.
millions in World War II.
Right.
And they're just like, you know what? Having a simple life and doing the basics is that's the good life.
Yeah.
And but then their kids are just like
We don't want that.
they're just like, I don't want all these restrictions and stereotypes. I
Yeah.
want to be free.
Yeah.
And we got the sexual revolution of the 1960s from that. So maybe that's a good point to transition to the baby boomers
Yeah.
a little bit. And then we can circle back and look at these three generations and how Christianity appeals to them,
Right.
and just kind of look at them together.
For
So
sure.
yeah, let's go there. Let's talk about the boomers.
There you go. The okay boomer, or whatever people say nowadays. But that generation is referring to people who were born in the what would you say, in the 50s. Let me just pull up my notes here. But like, because what you have to understand is, as we already alluded to, like, the men came home from World War II, wanted to raise families, and boy did they. Like, they just had a lot of kids. And so, just like, and they're called baby boomers, or the baby boom, because it's an economic term, I guess, of the a boom and bust. You have the things exploding, and then in terms of popularity. But, well, in this case, it's the explosion of the birth rate. And so they were born between 46 and 64. So I guess I was correct in saying that the 1950s is the best decade to think of when they were born, that sort of thing. And they're now in their 60s and 70s. So this is the age group that lived through all of what I call the culture shifts of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because every one of those decades had an unimaginable impact on at least American culture, and we'll get into that. But they lived through that, and they were the cause of some of that. But now they're reaching, senior citizen age, and in my opinion, I think that there's a real need for them to shift their understanding of what how old they are. Just like each of us has to understand we're all getting older, right?
Yeah, so these are people that are in their late 50s, early 60s, all the way into their 70s, like
Right.
the first half of their 70s right now. So
Yeah.
mostly at this point, 60s and 70s, although you have a couple of younger ones there in the late 50s who might have been born in 1964. And to be a boomer is to be what? What are these people, what shapes them? What do they have in common with each other?
Right.
What would you say?
At the very, and one thing we have to point out is, because that's almost 20 years an age range, right? So there was a first wave and a second wave of baby boomers, and with all of these generations, like it is sort of arbitrary which years are picked to represent those generations. So you have to imagine that every generation, if you're born towards the end of it, there's gonna be overlap there. Or in my case, for example, I'm an older millennial, but I was born very close to Gen Xers, both in terms of my birth year, but also literally having older Gen Xers as siblings, and so there's overlap, and I identify with Gen X. So going back to this, there are going to be baby boomers who are younger who might identify more with Gen X. But the key issue for baby boomers, especially the older ones, is, as we said, their parents, the greatest generation, wanted to give them, or rather, the silent generation was their parents. They wanted to give their kids, the baby boomers, everything. And I think, and you can, anybody out there who has more expertise on these subjects can certainly correct us if I'm wrong about this, but they expected their kids to be grateful for what they were giving them.
Yeah.
Right. And the very opposite happened. The kids rejected that lifestyle, and exactly to your point of they perceived restrictions being placed upon them, their own freedom, and that's just human nature. We don't like when we've all gone through this over the past couple of years. We don't like it when there are restrictions placed upon our freedom, and that's what baby boomers felt, that their parents were saying, we'll give you all you need to survive, but you have to follow our rules. We can give you a great life, but you have to follow our rules, and they didn't want to do that.
Yeah. I see this phenomenon very much in our world today, where, having lived through a number of these wars in the 90s, early 2000s, the first one with Iraq, then we had the second one, then we had Afghanistan. And during those years, especially like in the Bush years, George W. Bush, it was incredible the solidarity that Americans had with each other. And it was incredible how much discontent there has been over the last several years. Certainly the Trump years, but even at the tail end of the Obama years, there's just been increasingly polarization and conflict. I hate to say this, but like, there's a strong correlation between America having peace and prosperity, and then like America fighting with America over different issues that they just seem to like conjure up out of nowhere. And I remember watching one of these State of the Union addresses that we had during Trump, and just like the absolute rancor among the opposing political party. And then our most recent one, everyone is standing shoulder to shoulder. Why? Well, Russia just attacked Ukraine. And so now everyone is going to stand shoulder to shoulder and put aside differences. And, I think that's a horrible thing about human nature, or, the way people just are, is that when we feel threatened, then we work together. And when we don't, we find ways to nitpick at each other. It's like being a kid in the back of the minivan for a 6-hour road trip. Like, you never noticed that freckle on your brother's nose before, but now that's all you can focus on and like make fun of. And he never noticed your bad breath until you were sitting right next to him. And, you fight like cats and dogs because there's nothing to do, right? There's no extra, but as soon as a bully comes in, you stand together and you're like, that's my brother and I'll die for him, And there's something weird, something to be said about that. And the boomers just had a lot of stability as children. Right. And then it's interesting though, when war did come for them in the shape of Vietnam, it did not galvanize. Not at all. Like, the war of Vietnam became this huge controversy, and you had all these protests. So that's really different about that generation.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about how there was a unity. I think when faced with war, there is a certain degree of unity that comes into the culture, and I think there's obviously perhaps you would say biological reasons for that. We are the descendants of those people who when adversity came together and fought it off and survived and were able to have children and so on. So that makes sense that happens, but I think part of it has to be like to the point to your point about the Vietnam War and how the baby boomers did not unite against that. There has to be something convincing to fight against, if that makes sense. Like the Nazis and and Japan trying to take over the world. Yeah, I think that makes sense. We should fight against that. But trying to fight for one half of a civil war in Vietnam, that is perhaps not an issue that people wanted to give up their lives for. Yeah. And quite frankly, that's what I saw, especially as an outsider, so to speak, here in Canada. We did not take part in the Second Iraq War in 2003. And so from an outsider, I saw the people who were against it and were like, yeah, well, what are we even doing in that country? There's lots of bad people in the world that might have nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. So why are they there? Why did they invade? And it's quite,
and then they didn't even have them.
And they didn't even have them, exactly.
So the whole pretense for the war was totally disproved. And then it's not like America said, oh, oops,
we'll
They're
leave
like,
now.
no, we're here, so now we're gonna totally replace the government, and not to get too political, but it seems like that's part of how ISIS got going was American meddling in Iraqi affairs, so I'm speaking as a Gen Xer, seeing these things,
right?
And we'll get to my generation in a minute, I'm sure, but like, we have a profound sense of skepticism towards the government. Exactly. Like we just don't like if they're saying it, that's evidence to not believe it. Which right. I don't know if we just inherited that from the boomers, but they definitely got that party started as far as like, what, the government is flawed and it needs to be challenged. And they did that with their hippies. They did that with their Vietnam protests. They did that all throughout their young adult years. Standing up, speaking truth to power in courageous as sometimes foolish ways, but really blaze that trail for later generations to do that as well.
Yeah, they were against, I guess, any kind of authority, and I think that the key that those of us who are in the later generations need to learn the lesson that they gave us, which is, be skeptical of authority, but if it's legitimate authority and it's moral authority, like a legitimate moral authority, then you shouldn't reject that. However, the government, and we're getting into, we said we didn't want to be too political, but the government is by definition not moral. It is implementing its authority through force, and that to me is not moral. So. We inherited a distrust of the government because of their distrust of authority. But hopefully we as, younger people, younger than them at least, can have that balance in our lives.
Okay.
Of distrusting bad authority, but, submitting to good authority.
Yeah. And I think the question you ask any boomer is, where were you when JFK was assassinated? And they're just like, boom, they know right where they were. Whereas people in my generation, it's like, where were you when 9/11 happened?
Exactly.
And, each generation has its own unique crisis. Not that other generations aren't there as well. It's just certain ones will like be shared and burn into the group, the generational consciousness stronger. Yeah. And that for boomers, I think had a profound impact on them, that a president could get just killed. Yeah. I mean, that probably happened a number of times before, but like for the boomers, that was definitive.
It was the pivotal moment because it wasn't just any president, right? Like JFK was young, charismatic, and inspiring, and like even though he was a Democrat, my sense is that he inspired people on both sides and that sort of thing. I think the assassination of JFK completely changed. Like the baby boomers may have gone with what their parents wanted, and follow the rules and be good, good little boys and girls. But that sort of shattered their what's that expression? Like it shattered their illusions, I guess, if that's the right expression, right? It showed that no, bad things can really happen, and then things just continued to to get worse in terms of other people like Martin Luther King Jr. getting assassinated and Robert Kennedy getting assassinated. Those further it basically instilled within them that sort of cynicism, right?
Yeah. I tell you, the movie that really helped me understand my parents was Forrest Gump.
Yes.
When I saw that movie, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
so that's what these people are all, that's where they're coming from. And of course, the movie's totally fictional, but it weaves a narrative through all
Right.
these big events like the landing on the moon and Vietnam and, entrepreneurial, Bubba Gump and the fish and like how you can end up with these like really wealthy entrepreneurs, and they introduce Apple at the end of it. And, so much of it was fascinating to see the world as if I was seeing it through their eyes when they were younger.
Right.
And that's what that movie really did. And I remember my parents saying that they really enjoyed the movie too, because it was like, oh yeah, there's always like nostalgia happening for them. And for me, it's not nostalgia, it's like educational, like,
Right.
whoa, okay, so that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so you do have movies that come along and try to do this to sort of like unveil that mindset. And I thought that one was pretty helpful.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't want to downplay the '90s and everything that's happened since then, but there's something really fascinating about the '60s, '70s, and '80s.
Yeah.
And like the baby boomers had the turbulent '60s is what I like to call it. Like there was so much hope on the one hand with having JFK as president and having the space race and landing a man on the moon and all that stuff, but then all of the terrible things that happened, which led into the Vietnam War and the '70s becoming a time of like, I don't know, hippies and that sort of thing, like just trying to find yourself. And like I don't know if they knew what they were looking for, and we'll get into that in a moment. Like I think the main thing that we as Christians need to be thinking about in terms of these generations is that every generation is looking for something deeper.
Yeah.
Every generation is looking for something to fill the void, and boy, did the baby boomers try everything to find to fill that void, right?
Yeah. So let's ask the question then, because we can come back to looking at the younger generations in our next episode. But let's ask the question about how does Christianity appeal to these three generations, to the silent generation, or the greatest generation, the silent generation, and the boomers. I would imagine, having heard a little bit about the silent generation and their search for the good life in stability, that a lot of Christian ethics would be really appealing to them,
Right.
like love your neighbor as yourself. Just kind of like the bread and butter basics of a well-functioning society, trusting authority,
Right.
doing to others as you would have them do unto you. These kinds of statements that we find in the Bible.
Right.
What about that older generation, though? What do you think would appeal to them, the greatest generation?
Well, I think that for the very oldest ones that are still among us, and as a pastor of a church that has people of that age group, I have to be mindful of what church meant to them in their lives and what it still means to them. For them, it's not going to be too different than even what the silent generation went through and appreciated about church, which was the moral stability that it gives all of us. It gives us a moral foundation to live our lives by, and a sense of community. And certainly, nostalgia is going to be a part of every generation's experience. So they really love singing the classic hymns and hearing a good sermon. And so for them, sort of the model that all of our church, most churches still continue to hold on to, of singing songs and preaching sermons, that to them is a comfort. Like they really, especially if we sing contemporary songs at our church. We sing songs that were just written, or songs that were written 20 years ago, or we every so often will do a classic hymn too. And you just see the smile on their faces, right? So
Yeah, like "Great is Thy Faithfulness" or something like that, or
Exactly.
"How Great Thou Art." Yeah.
yeah,
We do have some at this church, Living Hope, where I pastor. We do sing some classic hymns from time to time too, and I've definitely seen people light up. I remember going to a Church of God event, and I think it was Christian Workers Seminar, and this was like over a decade ago, maybe even more, and they were introducing some contemporary music and the guitar and
right.
and like. For those of you who don't know, Christian Workers Seminar, at least in those days, was like the kind of event that my baby boomer dad, when he first went to it, he was like, "I love this event. It made me feel so young." Because everyone was from the older generations at it. And I'm sure that like changes with time, of course, but nobody was singing along to like the contemporary Christian music. There were like 5 people in the audience singing, and then here's Aaron Winter. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah,
incredibly talented musician. He's up there like strumming his guitar. He's so into it. He's just got such a great voice, and he's singing music that I like, and I'm just like, oh, this is so great. Like nobody's singing. And then like some lady comes out and sits at a piano or a keyboard and just strikes up some chords from some old hymn that I had like never even heard of, and the room just went nuts. And they like the volume, like like my ears hurt. They were all singing so loud, just belting it out and singing these hymns. And it was like, okay, you guys, all right, you voted with your voices. Like, it's pretty clear what you want here.
We could have a whole discussion. We could have had this whole discussion just be about music and the different generations and how that relates to the church, because like I don't think we can underestimate the impact that I guess Elvis and the Beatles and a lot of these pop acts from the 50s and 60s, what difference that, how anybody who was young in the 50s and 60s and on are completely, totally fine with, let's say, rock music or pop rock or whatever. Right. And we wouldn't think twice. Of course,
they're not skeptical about it at all.
Yeah. But everybody who lived before then, especially if they were traditional, born and raised in church, they are going to be skeptical of that kind of music. And that was some of the battles that I remember even attending a Pentecostal church growing up. That even that was a struggle. We're supposed to be like the free, wild Christians, and that was a transition for the church I grew up in, and it was a hard transition here at this church as well.
Yeah.
So,
what else about Christianity appeals to these older generations, and that's important to talk about here?
Well, I don't know if there's anything further. Like, I think, just to restate, like, they embraced Christianity because of, I guess, to use this word again, the stability that it brought, because that's what they were looking for. Yeah. And they viewed Christianity as, and we're speaking in general terms here, obviously, but, a lot of people just viewed Christianity as a moral system, and that's the way it should have been treated. And so when they gave that to their children, the baby boomers, they weren't interested in that.
Yeah, I would say too, for Greatest is Silent, there's probably more identity in the brand as far as denominational pride. Whereas, like, by the time I came along, most denominations in my area are covert. Like, they do not put that they are secretly Baptists
Right.
on their church signs. And yet they are. If you look at their website, the way you find out is you look at what school they went to,
Right.
and if it's a Southern Baptist theological seminary, they're just like missionary-minded Baptists in the north, in the north. But whereas the older generations were very like proud of, like, I am Church of God, or I am a Methodist, or I am a Baptist, and that's my team. Like people have allegiance to sports teams.
Right.
That same sort of thing with respect to their denomination. And you don't see that as much after really the boomers.
Right. No, that's true. Well, and that's, I don't know if you want to transition to the baby boomers.
Yeah,
and their
let's do
experience
that.
with
Let's
church.
go there.
Because what I saw, because my parents, even though they were technically born at the very end of the silent generation, probably can more so be understood as older baby boomers. Mm-hmm. And my wife's parents are older baby boomers, and I kind of got a sense from my own experience and just what I've learned about people of that age group is they were looking for something more than what their parents were giving them, and that was true on multiple levels. But especially when it came to Christianity, they rejected institutional Christianity, if you want to call it that, and wanted this is where probably the expression that we hopefully have heard of, it's not a religion, it's a relationship, if you've heard that expression before, probably came from the baby boomers, because that's what they were looking for. And there was all these kinds of if the rise of the televangelists in the 70s and 80s, seeker sensitive movements where they were trying to appeal to what the baby boomers wanted, culturally. And again, that's the beginning of the shift of music in church being not just a piano and the organ or whatever, but, full band and contemporary songs.
You said in your sermon series, boomers grew up believing that the world was theirs for the taking.
Right.
And I think that was a quote from the book you mentioned before, Sticking Points.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that as far as Christianity goes?
Yeah. I mean, I think, in relationship to history, we can see that they wanted, as I mentioned in this series, they tried to find something deeper in their lives, and they tried to look to civil rights. They tried to look to it being anti-war and all these things. And hey, that's good. I think everybody should be equal, and I think we shouldn't be at war. But you're not going to find what really fills you up inside in those things. That can only come from God. And so the world was theirs for the taking, and they tried to make a difference as best that they could see. I just wonder if perhaps they had focused their energy on connecting with God and building a society that's based on that, how much better off everybody would be, including them. But that's not how history went.
Yeah, it seems like since they believed the world was theirs for the taking, I think when I think of that, I think of being emboldened to change the world.
Yes, right.
And that's what they did. They changed everything.
Yeah, some for the better, some not so good.
Yeah, they changed the music. They changed, sexual ethics. They changed how people looked at marijuana. These things are legalized later on, but like they were the ones that were smoking the joints down in the corner, and they weren't druggies. They were just like, oh, I'm just young and free, And they changed the church in profound ways. Right. Going away from the pews to chairs, getting, these like beach churches in California where a lot of these movements got the Vineyard movement got to start, or even the Way International really tapped into a lot of that California energy. And, there was this sense of like, let's remake everything and make it better and not settle for what my grandparents gave us. But now, that's when they were young. But now it's the opposite. Now they are the grandparents. And now they're saying, why do we have to learn another new song, Pastor Dan? We already had 500 songs. Why do we need 500? What's wrong with, these good Jesus songs from the 80s? Why do we need, Hillsong or Bethel or any of these newfangled, highly repetitive songs that, don't speak to me. So what do you think about all that?
Yeah, that's well. I alluded to that earlier in the sense that there is every generation has to reach a point where they realize that they've now become older, obviously, and but where they thought they were in the timeline of generations, they're actually older, further along. So baby boomers, to like what you're saying, that they're now getting up there and becoming the elder statesmen of the church, and that they should be respected, and we should throw them a bone every once in a while. I definitely think that, but just like they wanted to have church be experience church in such a way where they could identify with it and relate to it. I think the same thing is true of younger people, and in fact that's what we're trying to do with the very younger generations, Gen Z and younger, is we can't give them church the way my parents or even how I experienced growing up, because quite frankly that's not going to relate. They're not going to relate to that. They're not going to identify with that. So that's, if it was good enough for them, it's good enough. It was good enough for us, and it's good enough for our kids, right?
Yeah. And I think too, listening to older generations is really helpful for me as a pastor, for you as a pastor, for other leaders, that we don't just write them off and say, what do they know? Well, they know a lot.
Exactly.
They've been through a lot, they've seen a lot, and they have wisdom.
Right.
And so it's really so important I'm trying to preach to myself here too, that we all listen and not just write them off and say, this is a terrible expression, okay, boomer.
Right.
It's just a way to trivialize and reject any kind of wisdom that people in that, it's a form of discrimination.
Yeah.
Our world is obsessed with racism right now. Well, it's generational racism against
Ageist.
It's ageist, like a whole group of people you're going to stereotype and dismiss.
Right.
Well, that's the very thing you're trying to fight. So it doesn't make any sense to use that against others. And I think boomers have a lot to share, a lot of wisdom. And, I think their relentless desire for like true connection over institutional, Christianity, I think that's really something that is important for us not to lose.
Right.
We don't want to get calcified into, well, this program works, so we're just going to keep doing it. A boomer's going to come along and be like, yeah, but do you have a relationship with God? Like, do you actually talk to him? Do you actually spend time? Like, when you sing the songs, is it just a performance, or are you really connecting? And I think that they bring that prejudice, like good prejudice, to the table of like always asking those kinds of questions about the heart, which I think are so important, and we don't want to lose that.
Yeah. It's possible that we could lose it, but I would say that they changed the church. Again, I'm only speaking from at least Protestant churches, and especially the churches that I'm more familiar with. But I think they changed the church for good. And like that has now become like totally expected that you would, of course, you would be searching for something to have a personal connection with God. Like, it's not just about the religion, but it's about something personal as well. We should be grateful for that. In fact, when I did the sermon about the baby boomers, I took the time at the end of the service just to thank them and pray for them and say, let's not have the attitude of okay boomer. Let's, they have to be malleable. They have to be willing to change, the baby boomers at this point in their lives, I think, in order for us to have to work towards reaching the next generation. But I do think that we should be grateful towards them as well.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time for this episode. What else should we say about the boomers or about these older generations with respect to Christianity?
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything additional.
Okay.
Because I really think that is the main point there. That the way I just sort of laid it out is,
okay,
that they need to be respected, but at the same time, my hope is that baby boomers will make a smooth transition into the elder statesman role.
Yeah. And as they pursued freedom relentlessly and then gave their children more freedom, they probably thought, oh, well, our children will just value the same things we value.
Yeah, right, right.
Did that happen?
No. Not at all. And here's the thing, and here's a little preview for next episode. The baby boomers did the same thing and tried to give their children freedom, and in a sense expected them to be accepted and embraced. And Gen X did the same thing that the baby boomers did. They rejected their parents to a degree and went a different direction.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for this insight. It's a fascinating subject, and very few people are talking about it. I don't hear when the millennials, like, somebody finally labeled you guys. Right. And books started coming out about you guys. Like, everyone was like obsessed with the millennials in Christian ministry, at least. Yeah. And I read a book about you guys a while back, and I was like, oh, it's fascinating. And then it was over. And so I think this is, but it is important to consider these older generations too. And next time we'll look at Gen X, which I think is mislabeled. It should be called the greatest generation, but that's just my prejudice. And then the millennials, and then we'll go through the other letters of the alphabet until we get to the young ones today. So thanks so much for your time on this, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thanks, John.